Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and admit folks and just do a little having people identify themselves in the chat, and then we will proceed.
I can monitor all that stuff, Beth, after you get started.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to admit everybody and then anyone that comes in after. Welcome, everybody. Go ahead and just rename myself, which I forgot to do. Welcome. As folks are arriving, I would love to have us just type in the chat your name, where you're joining us from, and maybe we'll say your favorite Cambridge monument or memorial, something that speaks to you. So go ahead and type those in while we're getting started. So far, we have West Cambridge and New Orleans. So our reaches, this is the age of Zoom, right? The beauty of our digital world, getting to see folks from all over the country. Rainey joining from what is currently known as Boston. Yes, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Rainey, for reminding us that this is the traditional land of the Massachusetts people. That is in my intro as well. That's so important to remember. Amy is joining us from Cambridgeport. The small markers commemorating squares named after people, usually found at small intersections around town. Isn't that interesting? We were thinking of doing a program about that and how those people have been somewhat lost to history, and kind of exploring Cambridge's squares and intersections and who they're named after, reminding us of all those folks. So. Well, thank you all so much for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started, and we'll add folks in as they come. So I want to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Beth Folsom, and I am the programs manager here at Cambridge Historical Society. And before we begin, as Rainey reminded us, I want to just acknowledge that we, the society and the land, the area it serves, is sitting on the traditional land of the Massachusetts people. So welcome to our virtual history cafe. We're thrilled to have you here. And as you all know, this is a part 2 of our commemoration series on Cambridge and its monuments and memorials. We had such a great discussion last time, and we didn't get to finish everything that we wanted to tackle. So this is part 2, and stay tuned for part 3. I'd like to start by reminding you that throughout the program, you can use the chat box to ask questions and comments. And I'd like to extend a special thank you and welcome to the Society members who have made today's event possible. If you want to consider joining our group, head over to our website, which is cambridgehistory.org, and click on the support button at the top of that page. And you can also sign up there to receive our e-news so that you don't miss out on any great future events that we're planning. And a reminder that today's event is free, but donations are welcome. And a big thank you to many of you today who made a donation, and we really appreciate it. Tomorrow you'll be getting a survey link via email for today's program, and asking how you liked it, what you thought we did well, what you thought we could improve, as well as suggestions for future events. And we really depend on that. We love your feedback. We want to hear how to make these things even better for you. So please do fill that out when you get it. Helps us a lot. And So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our guest speaker today. We are thrilled to have Eric Höweler with us. He is principal at Höweler Yoon Architects and also professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. And we're thrilled to have him here. And he's going to talk about his process, his firm's process at designing the Sean Collier Memorial. So what I'm going to do really quickly before Eric starts is I'm just going to show a couple of slides of the Collier Memorial so that you all can, for those of you who are not familiar with it, can get a sense of what it looks like. And then we will welcome Eric to dive in. Hold on one sec. I'm going to share. So these are some pictures. This is an overhead. I believe this is from the early conceptual phase of the design, but let's see. So there we have view through one of the open spaces. Got one more, the inscription. Have a view of some of these granite blocks that are around the memorial. And we have a close-up, which I hope Eric will talk about as well, of the Braille inscription that's at the memorial. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand it over to Eric.
Thanks, Beth. I think I need to be made able to share. Currently, I'm not able to share.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get you set with that. Make you co-host. Does that seem to be working? You're a co-host now. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Great. Thanks so much for the invitation. We have been working in a kind of public realm mode for a while, and I wanted to share Collier in the context of some of our work. But we can loosely say we might talk about themes of plinth, monument, platform, and place. And those are themes and topics that we use when we talk about our work. This first image is actually an installation we did for the Athens Olympics in 2004, which was just using light and sound to sort of create a place. And it was interactive. When you walked through it, it lit up and made a kind of white noise sound. And then this was actually reinstalled in 2005 in front of MIT for the president's inauguration, the MIT president's inauguration. So a piece of interactive public art that sort of went from the States to Athens, came back, landed in Cambridge, and then now is in a storage locker somewhere. But our early work, because my wife and partner, Aids Yoon, was teaching at MIT, had a lot to do with expanding the kind of repertoire of designers to think not just about stone and material, but also to think about electronics, interactivity, light, and sound as a kind of expanded palette for design. Some of the things that we think about when we think about history is context. This is a project that was done by Fred Wilson, an artist who was a guest, a kind of artist in residence at the Maryland Historical Society. And part of his contribution, I think, to discourses of art practice and institutional critique was he put these slave shackles in the same vitrine as this silver work. And he just called it metalwork, 1793 to 1880. So that's an incredibly powerful move. He didn't make anything new. He just rearranged the artifacts in the collection. And by putting slave shackles adjacent to silverware from the same era, he was sort of showing us, and this was done in 1992, he was showing us that context matters, that we can't just think about the kind of pretty silverware without thinking about the kind of shackles that sort of were part of the economy that produced that wealth and that silver. So when we think about memorials and monuments, we think about memory, and we think about institutions and the roles of institutions to sort of frame those narratives. Fred Wilson is sort of at the top of my mind in terms of thinking about that. I wanted to share a couple of memorials that we've been involved with or we've been inspired by. This is a book that my partner, Aids Yoon, did, I think it was 2003, after 9/11. she got a grant from the Whitney Museum to do an artist book, and she made a book with 110 pages. Each page had these 2 squares cut out of it. And so the World Trade Center had 110 floors. So she basically punched out all the floors from the 110 floors of the World Trade Center from this book. And this book it's small, it's compact, you can hold it in your hand, but she described it as a kind of portable memorial, something you could take with you. And within it is trapped the kind of void of the Twin Towers. So memorials don't have to be big, they can be quite small, but I do think they sort of evoke a kind of memory, they trigger a kind of response, and they can be conceptual. They ask you to do conceptual work to sort of put it back together in your head. The other one that I think is quite beautiful in terms of 9/11 is the tribute in light, which is just 2 columns of light, extremely ephemeral, quite beautiful. And every year this has become a tradition to sort of light these columns of light on the anniversary. Getting close to Harvard, I know Beth talked about John Harvard in the last session. One of my favorite artists is Krzysztof Wodiczko, who teaches also at the GSD. He's an artist that has been working on projection art. So he took the sort of statue of John Harvard as a kind of screen onto which he projected video of people, random people, young people, old people, white people, black people, and he actually animated them. And so it was kind of eerie to see John Harvard overlaid with different voices, and he sort of brought this image of John Harvard to life, you know, offering commentary, so that even monuments and memorials that are sort of done can be sort of redone and somehow reanimated. So I thought that was an interesting sort of overlay practice to sort of bring something from the past maybe more into the future, maybe have it sort of impact us differently. People say that there's nothing more invisible than a memorial, you know, because we tend to sort of see them every day, and then to some extent they sort of move into the background. And so how do we bring those things continuously into the foreground? How do they continue to sort of engage us? Other memorials that we love, this is the Princess Di Memorial in London. It's a kind of ring, there's a kind of water feature, and the water goes from being serene and quiet to sort of rapids and, you know, splashy. It's a place where people like to hang out, you know, so it's not all contemplative. If you go there in the summertime, there's kids with their feet in the water, and it's very much alive. And so how do we sort of inject these things into the public life, into a public consciousness? The one memorial I think that shifted the whole discourse around memorials is the Vietnam Memorial. I think this one is the most famous. I think people know this one. The cut in the ground, this sort of polished granite, names inscribed there. It's very mute, doesn't say too much. You know, I think it's incredibly powerful. There was a sense that this memorial was not sufficient. And so in the years afterwards, these statues were added. And I think for me, this represents a moment where memorials went abstract, and there was a kind of desire for representation, for imagery, for something that allowed us to connect to those individuals. The Vietnam Memorial, as designed by Maya Lin, was perceived to be too abstract, not inviting a kind of empathy, you know, and somehow the imagery of these 3 soldiers was compensated for that kind of abstraction. This has been, you know, infinitely sort of critiqued back and forth from both sides. I think Maya Lin actually got a lot of death threats, you know, because of her design. And so this is a charged landscape. People really care passionately about this, and they're willing to sort of to fight over these topics. The other one in my sort of preamble is the Museum to the Murdered Jews of Europe. This is in Berlin. This was designed by Peter Eisenman with Richard Serra. It's incredibly powerful. You sort of wander through it, and it just speaks volumes in its abstraction. On the other hand, the critique has been that, you know, where's the names, where's the content, you know? And the question is, memorials have content. You know, they're not just spaces to be inhabited like a house or a train station. They have meaning and things they need to convey. So if I go here, where's the content? In fact, if you go here in the corner of one of these sites, there is a learning center, you know, so you descend into a kind of basement space, and there's books, there's reading rooms, there's, you know, content on multimedia formats. And so there wasn't, I think, a requirement for this project that it not only be a kind of experiential abstraction, but that it also deliver on the kind of access to content. And so I think Peter Eisman struggled to incorporate that learning center into his design because his design is so absolute. But that's something we sort of had in mind as we were thinking about these things. Speaking of distributed memorials, these are kind of beautiful Stolpersteine. These are cobbles that are embedded in streets throughout Germany, throughout Europe. And they sort of memorialize Jews that were taken from their homes, and these are placed in front of their homes and where they were taken to and when they died, you know. And so all over around Europe, you find these incredible, very subtle, they're just sort of, you know, out of your perception, but when you stumble on them, that stumbling creates a sense of recognition. It sort of jolts you into attention. It jolts you into a kind of consciousness, and they're pervasive, and that's another thing that makes them powerful. You see them everywhere. I saw one in Rome just in January. I thought, oh my God, you know, this is someone who lived here in Rome, and they were taken to Auschwitz, they were taken to Birkenau, they were taken elsewhere. So incredibly powerful. They don't have to be big to be powerful. This one, it's still standing. This is in Richmond. This is General Lee, seen from above. And this monument is slated to be removed. It's part of the Richmond Monument Ave. A lot of the other monuments have been removed. This is the last one. You can see this incredible vantage. It's covered in graffiti. And these monuments, you know, have generated so much sort of debate, the kind of appropriateness, the inappropriateness. There's a sense that in this moment, these are inappropriate. They don't speak to us. They're in a way, they're hateful and they're damaging. So there's a process in place to remove these. This is the drawings of that sort of pedestal. And closer to home, I think, you know, the killing of George Floyd has sort of ignited a kind of incredible sort of debate in this culture about what is relevant today. And I think Beth is sort of prompting us to think, what deserves to be memorialized? Does anything need to be sort of taken down if it doesn't speak to us, or maybe it speaks to us with a voice from a different time? You know, it may have been appropriate. We don't find it appropriate today. As a culture, I think we need to sort of figure out what our values are and how our memorials sort of consolidate, they precipitate out our values, and they sort of translate those values into stone, into wood, into sort of material. And so I think this young man in the foreground, this is Caleb Hawkins. He was he's a student at the GSD. He's studying with Krzysztof Wodiczko. Right after George Floyd, he started projecting images of George Floyd on monuments. This is in Cambridge, right? He projected this image of George Floyd on Boston City Hall. And so he's sort of taking up a kind of technique. It's almost a kind of guerrilla tactic to sort of broadcast, you know, in full scale these images. And what's the power of that? You know, what's the power of temporary versus the power of permanence? You know, granite versus light. This is something I noticed the other day as I was walking in Boston. You know, our DOT signage can be appropriated for sending messages of, you know, recognizing our heroes. I very quickly wanted to detour into a project we just finished at UVA, University of Virginia, is the campus designed by Thomas Jefferson. In the left-hand corner, there's a slave holding a white child. We just completed this memorial at UVA to acknowledge the slaves that built the campus. This was 10 years in the making, this memorial, and it just opened right before COVID, right before, you know, George Floyd. And so it sort of coincides with a kind of moment where people are saying we need to acknowledge our past. You know, we can't sort of sweep it under the rug. We need to sort of, you know, be deliberate about that. We inscribed names, we inscribed occupations, we inscribed kinship. You know, and the crazy thing is that there were 4,000 slaves. We don't know their names. So this memorial actually inscribes these cuts, these marks. They're placeholders, so 4,000 cuts. We only know about 900 names, 900 references. So in a way, the absence of names is as powerful as the presence of names. And this effect, when it rained, the water sort of got trapped in these cuts and then started trickling down. It looked like the memorial was crying or bleeding. Incredibly powerful, not something we anticipated. You know, memorials have experiential effects. People read things into them. One of the descendants from one of the slaves told me these are the tears of our ancestors. She was already interpreting. She was already adding meaning. So, and then this image shows, it's hard to see, but there's a pair of eyes here sort of inscribed in the outside of this ring. And these are eyes of a photograph of Isabella Gibbons, who was a slave who was freed. And it was one of the few photographs we had, so we inscribed it in the exterior. To some extent, this is a requirement from the community who said, we want to see imagery. We want to see images of slaves. Turns out we don't have a lot of images of slaves. They weren't photographed. We have Isabella Gibbons because her owner was a professor who taught at UVA, who went on to found the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So this image is in the Boston Public Library, and that's why we have it, you know. So interesting sort of turn of events. Another view of the memorial, inside smooth with names, outside's rough and cleft, and has the imagery embedded in it. Right after Black Lives Matter, this was a site where a lot of people gathered for 9 minutes to recognize the time that the police officer was kneeling on George Floyd's neck. So it became inaugurated through its occupation, through other people saying, we need a place to gather, we need a place to reassert our values, we need a place to say that we will not tolerate this anymore. So power comes not from a designer, it comes from how people see it, how they interpret it, how they read it. Okay, that was my preamble. Maybe I went too long. Collier, which is what I was asked to talk about. I think Beth sort of introduced it already last week or in your last session. It is for the marathon for Sean Collier, who was killed on campus by the Tsarnaev brothers in the kind of days that followed. Immediately, these kind of informal memorials spring up. People are looking to find ways to manage their grief. And so these personal tokens, these images, these are incredibly meaningful, you know, and there's certainly a role for this kind of outpouring of public grief. Students folded cranes in the Status Center. So if you go there, these beautiful little white cranes, hundreds of cranes to memorialize Sean Collier. One of his colleagues wrote his name on his leg, his badge number, 179, and ran the marathon. And so just a Sharpie marker on someone's leg saying, I'm running in memory of my friend, you know, this is the date he was killed. So this is a memorial. So memorials take many different forms, and they're very personal. They can be ephemeral, they can be monumental. My wife, Mi-Jin Yoon, was teaching at MIT. She was asked to design the memorial, and she was handed a binder with, I think there was 180 ideas, you know, that had come from the community saying, we think it should be like this. We think we should name a street. You know, how can we memorialize in chalk? Maybe there's a flag, maybe there's a field of flowers, you know, so lots of people submitted ideas. Our job as designers was to say, how do we take all these ideas and these desires and turn it into something permanent? You know, people had asked for boulders. Sean was an avid hiker. He loved being outdoors. He talked about a cairn, a place where boulders were kind of stacked to sort of monumentalize or mark a place. People said it'd be nice to have a forest. You know, he loved the outdoors. Can we have a forest? Police officer said, can we have some flags? We'd love some flags. He was very patriotic. And so we're taking all these inputs together, thinking about it. People talk about Boston strong, MIT strong, Collier strong. You know, MIT's slogan is mens et manus, hand and mind, and they added fortis. And we thought about strength and you know, what makes us strong? You know, how do we be strong? And we thought maybe there's something about that. What brings strength? Is it diversity? Is it openness? Is it you know, the fact that we're all different and we still come together to do something? So we designed a figure, you know, and architects talk about figure. It's a shape. It's something strong, a 5-legged figure. And from that, we sort of intersected it with a boulder that people had asked for. We subtracted the boulder from the figure. So we said, we're going to take that boulder and remove it. And so we've scooped it out. Geometrically, we call it a Boolean operation. You know, the difference between this and that is what's left. And so I said, you know, this is a conspicuous absence. We want you to come here. We also talked about, you know, is it a star? Is it a hand? You know, if we respond to terrorism with clenching a fist, is that the right response? Is it an open hand that's always open? And part of our strength, I think, and part of our vulnerability is that we offer an open hand. You know, even in response to terror, our hand is still open. I think that's what differentiates us from other societies. We remain open, an open society. So an open hand. And then we propose that maybe it's made out of solid stone. So it's not about concrete that's sort of skinned in thin stone, but it's an arch, it's a vault, it's something that actually carries weight. And this was meaningful because in a way, every piece of stone in an arch is needed. You know, you take out one stone and it collapses. And so they're all unique pieces of stone. There are 33 pieces of stone, but they're all needed in order for it to span. And we thought that was a beautiful metaphor for a community of difference that comes together to achieve a kind of span, a span that accentuates or articulates a kind of strength, a kind of stability, a kind of equilibrium. So we proposed a structural arch, and this sort of confounded our contractor, our structural engineer, and our collaborator. How are we going to build this? We haven't built an arch in a long time. We did a lot of calculations. Structural engineers used a lot of software. We did hand sketches. We ended up designing the memorial so that it took the kind of structural principle, and it's the length of the buttress is relative to the thrust in the arch, right? So these blocks are trying to fall, they're jamming against other stones, and then those loads are transferred to the edges. We had to procure the blocks ourselves because blocks of stone don't come in those sizes. You know, if you ask for a stone, you know, quarry typically slab stones for kitchen counters, and we were doing something much bigger. So typically we don't use block stone for architecture. These were special stones, specially requested, specially procured. We spent a lot of time with the fabricators figuring out how to make this. And I think there's an incredible story about high tech and low tech. You know, these days we use a lot of computers to model. We use a lot of computers to fabricate. And so these are computer controlled saws that are cutting the stone. You know, in the old days, this would have been a lot of work to remove material. You think about Michelangelo, David, he saw David in the block and he had to sort of excavate, you know, David out from the block. And this wasn't David, but these were quite particular shapes that were being subtracted from these blocks. And some of these saws are pretty straightforward. They're all sort of driven by computers. Some of the saws are pretty sophisticated, and some of these were cut with robots. You know, so we train a robot to sort of carve based on our 3D model. We produce a 3D model. The robot then carves a stone with a high degree of precision to the hundredth of a millimeter, hundredth of an inch, different, but incredibly precise. And then it's finished by hand. Someone, a craftsperson, comes and flames the granite with a blowtorch. And this is the process of sort of getting the crystals in the stone to sort of flare up, and then he sort of scrapes it off, and that's what gives it that distinctive finish. So a unique process that combines like old technique, like arch building, and absolutely state-of-the-art sort of computer-controlled fabrication technology. All the blocks came to site. They came like this on a truck. The stone is a Virginia mist granite. It has a figure. You can see the white lines, they run through. And we wanted a stone that had character so that you could walk around it and say, oh, there goes that vein. It's not a slab of veneer. It's actually solid. You can sort of see it and see the movement of the veins through the stone. So it's a three-dimensional experiential thing. A couple other things, you know, the keystone is irregular. It's sort of matching the geometry of the legs. The legs are kind of irregular arranged. They sort of open up to Vassar Street. But the geometry of the keystone basically is perpendicular to the thrust of the vector of force. You know, so the leg here, this angle is always perpendicular to the axis of thrust. These are the interfaces. You could imagine these blocks are pushing against other blocks, and that's how they transfer load from block to block. We erected this in the snowiest winter of recorded memory. I think there was 103 inches of snow that winter. We removed the scaffold, and here we see for the first time the vault of the memorial. And everybody here was so thrilled. This is the team that put this together. I should point out Rob is Sean Collier's half brother. So Rob was the foreman on the job for Suffolk, and he was coincidentally Sean Collier's half brother. So it was like deeply, deeply meaningful for him to be here with his own hands, sort of building this memorial. This is one of the images I think Beth showed, a view from above, a view from within, where you see the sort of shallow arch, you see the blocks of stone. And when you know that they're solid, I think it takes on a different sort of quality. It's like we're making stone fly, it's like a Gothic buttress. It's held aloft through geometry, through these basic principles. And MIT loved the idea that you can look at this and you can see force, you can see engineering, you can see mechanics. This is the inscription, in the line of duty, Sean Collier. And you can see the studs in the pavers. This is something that we thought about. This is extremely attractive to skateboarders. And so we didn't want people grinding on this. We didn't think that was appropriate. And so one of our students at MIT was a X Games triple gold medal skateboarder. And so we asked her to consult on how she would approach this memorial as a skater. And we made sure that every approach that she would take was sufficiently obstructed by those stainless steel studs. That said, I have seen people BMXing on it, and I've always chased them off and said, please be respectful. This is not a place for you to BMX. I think Beth alluded to this already. The lights in the ground are the constellation the night that Sean Collier was killed. When I look up at the sky, I can sometimes find Orion's belt, because that's like 3 stars in a row. So I think if you saw those 3 stars, you would say, that's kind of familiar. I think this is a Big Dipper over here. It is very subtle, and it has meaning on different levels. So it's not always kind of in your face. It's something that we ask you to discover and to sort of learn about and to sort of interpret. And here, a close-up similar to what Beth showed. Not all the design ideas came from us. John DeFava, who's the head of MIT Police, he was the one who said, could we arrange those stainless steel studs in Braille to spell out 179? And we said, that's an awesome idea. I love it. I love the subtlety of it. So not everyone will get that, but that's okay. I feel like embedding meaning, allowing people to sort of read these memorials differently is part of what our job is to sort of not to write it all, but to encourage people to read it so that they see it and they sort of make it their own. Okay, I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was phenomenal context and amazing presentation. And I think that leads us very nicely into the question of the interplay of the subtlety of pieces of the memorial and the large kind of imposing nature of the granite itself. And how did you feel about incorporating those things, having kind of a juxtaposition in that memorial of the really big and the obvious, and then those more subtle things? And I guess in general, can you speak to that in your work in general, especially like the use of light and sound and more ephemeral or less sort of obvious elements, and how you see that?
The first image I showed was our first project, which was ephemeral. It was light and sound. It was fiber optics and electronics. And I think people had seen our work. A lot of our work up to that point was ephemeral, temporary installations, and they wondered if we could design a new kind of memorial, something temporary, something light, something ephemeral. We tried a number of things. But at a certain point, we realized that this was calling for something more permanent, something, and so a lot of people are saying, like, well, do all memorials need to be for eternity? Can they be more temporary? Can they be sort of made of wood or something? Could they be electronic and, electronic messaging, electronic message boards? Could they include projection and sound? And, what we found in many projects is that those electronics projects, they have a lifespan, and they if you take your iPhone and you put it outside for a week, how's that going to behave with the weather, And so there is something about architecture, about stone materials that have a kind of persistence, you know, and I think we also felt that at UVA, we talked about, you know, the distributed monuments versus the kind of ones that are sort of centralized. And when I saw those people at, you know, at the Black Lives Matter event, I said, I'm glad it's consolidated. I'm glad we can come together. I'm glad there's a place for people to come and not sort of everyone sort of, you know, thinking and commemorating and pledging sort of independently. So there's a place for kind of consolidation. There's a place for kind of permanence. So yeah, we started thinking ephemeral, but we ended up somewhere, I think, quite material. We did want to make this feel lightweight, and I think in a way, you know, this image shows a kind of lightness, even though we know each block weighs several tons. So the question of lightness and heaviness, we wanted it to feel like it was almost billowing, and I think we did achieve that.
Absolutely. We have a question in the chat from our friend Rainey Tisdale. She's asking if you could speak more about memorials that are useful to the general public. And she says, for example, the Princess Diana Memorial. And so what are your thoughts on usefulness?
Yeah, I love the Princess Diana Memorial. I've been to it a few times, and, you know, it's always well used. People, you know, and in a way, they take off their shoes and they put their feet in the water, you know, and you may say, well, that doesn't seem very respectful. On the other hand, I think the argument made by the designer was that it was really a place of joy and a place of celebration, not just a kind of somber space. There are places of that memorial where the water is still and more sort of reflective. And, you know, there are moments to that memorial where the water has different character, different moods. And so I like a memorial that can embody different experiences, different attitudes, different emotions, you know, and I think the Princess Di one does that beautifully. You know, I've seen kids climb on this one, and I say, hey, you know, to the parents, like, maybe this isn't the playground. And I have a kid, so I understand the urge. It looks like tremendous fun to climb and slide down. On the other hand, you know, I want these things to be part of everyday life. I don't want them to be remote. I want them to be accessible. In fact, we organized this one so you walk right through it. This is a gateway into East Campus, and I'm happy when people walk through it. I'm happy that it's part of their life, you know, that it's not sort of tucked away and forgotten. So how do we create that kind of engagement with everyday life while still respecting a kind of appropriateness? You know, does it have a kind of decorum? And, you know, if someone was skateboarding on it, I think I would chase them off. I don't think that's appropriate. But in a way, this public realm is a space that's shared, right? It's a kind of collective expression of our values, you know, so we all have to believe that there are values that we need to share. And these days it's harder and harder to sort of have that sense that there's a kind of shared sense of what's right and wrong.
That brings me to a article that just appeared today in the New York Times. So you may not have had a chance to see it, but the announcement that the Mellon Foundation is making a $250 million contribution over 5 years to rethink monuments and memorials and kind of how we relate to them. And I'm just wondering, you know, what your thoughts are on especially the projection monuments and repurposing or reimagining what one context is, the original context for the memorial, and using that versus potentially taking things down. So the Robert E. Lee statue, for instance. What are your thoughts? I know that it's very, there's a wide variety of thoughts of if we take these monuments down, we won't have that context for what we used to believe or what we used to idolize, right? But should we put them in context? Should we remove them? Should we project onto them? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, when we interviewed for the UVA Memorial, there was already a controversy around the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville. And the reason the neo-Nazis showed up in Charlottesville was because of that Robert E. Lee statue. That was their purported sort of object of, that was their reason for being there. And so that monument has since been covered, and I think it's also slated for removal. I think there's plenty of people who argue that if you erase history, you can't learn from it. On the other hand, I don't think the purpose of that monument was there to convey or to relate any sort of historic significance. It was built far too late, to really commemorate the Civil War. So it was really to intimidate. And I think the difference between monument and memorial is that monument has a kind of scale associated with it, and it's built to intimidate, versus memorial can be at any scale, and it has no kind of intimidation factor. That's why I like to show that little book, because it's a memorial. I think at UVA, we've designed a memorial. I think the statues on Monument Ave are monuments, and they're from a time where there was a different set of values, and I think that time has changed. So I think it is appropriate to take them down. I do think it's interesting to sort of think about where they might end up in a museum somewhere. They might want to keep them as, to remind us of what we did before. But I think the public realm is a slippery place to sort of articulate values, because it's hard to put a plaque on the public realm and say, this is how you should interpret that. And so if that statue of Robert E. Lee is to be there, I would want it to be somehow framed, somehow contextualized. And one sort of interesting side note, the team that built our UVA memorial is a Black-owned business, and they were a fantastic team. And they're also the team that's taken down the monuments on Memorial Ave, on Monument Ave, because the governor called the owner of that business and said, I can't find anyone else who will take them down. Will you take them down? And he said, yes, I will. And he said, fine, do it in a week. As memorials come up, monuments come down. I think these are changing times. I think there are ways, institutional ways, to commemorate and to remember these things, even if there are signs and symbols of hate.
Yeah. So I would love to use that as a cue to open up to the audience. I'm very curious to hear what folks have, what their thoughts are on what's missing. We've talked about what is in our commemorative landscape in Cambridge, but what are things that folks see as holes, as absences, people, events, concepts that should be commemorated in Cambridge that are not? And I like to use this as my son is in full elementary school mode, where they have a growth mindset, where you just say yet. So I'm going to say is not commemorated yet. So I would love to hear folks say that. And we have our first, Marika, LGBTQ history. That is definitely something that is not on the commemorative landscape as of right now. And I'll invite Marika if she wants to add a little more about where she thinks that should be, or how that would look. I'm curious to know what folks think.
Gee, thanks, Beth. No, I guess, gay marriage, right, happened here right in City Hall. So it just seems such a monumental moment. I wasn't in Cambridge at the time, but stories that I've heard of people just like coming together and celebrating and singing Broadway show tunes, and just like how wonderful, and just something wonderful to commemorate. I mean,
yeah, I love that the crosswalks in front of City Hall are painted rainbow. I love that. It's very small, it's a little gesture, but it just sort of reminds us of that moment, exactly what you were talking about, when there was such a huge celebration. So I think when I see that rainbow in the asphalt, I remember the celebration, and it triggers that memory. So I think it's a great idea. I would love to see that.
That also, though, I think speaks to the more ephemeral ways of memorializing, right? And so if you have something that happens either every year around that time or on significant anniversaries, and does that, the impermanence of it, does that decrease its symbolic nature, or does it make it more special? Is it something that happens only at a certain time, and so you look forward to it and you commemorate it in a way that if it were always there, you wouldn't necessarily think about it?
Yeah. I think that's a great point. If it's present all the time, it kind of recedes, you know, it kind of burns into our retina. In a way, we perceive things that are kind of intermittent more than when they're sort of always present. So that's I think quite powerful.
Annie has commented Indigenous heritage. Certainly that's something that we've been thinking a lot about as we, you know, in our very small way, do our land acknowledgement at the beginning of our program. And I wonder what that would look like. And I'd invite Annie, if she wants to type some more about that, to give us a little idea of if there's any specifics. But yeah, Cambridge doesn't have a whole lot of Indigenous recognition in its public spaces. I'll put a question, let's see, Amy says, related to LGBTQ AIDS quilt. Interesting that it travels and can be added to, yes, and that it's now so big. I believe it's been big for a while, too big to be displayed all in one place. So.
Yeah. I'll share a story about the AIDS quilt. When I was in grad school, a friend of mine designed a memorial for the AIDS quilt. And the challenge, of course, is that it's too big to be exhibited. He had a very kind of counterintuitive observation that in a way, our memorials allow us to put history on a shelf, you know, and we've done it, we've handled it, we can put it up there, and then we can sort of move on. And so his argument was like, we can't let them sit on the shelf. We have to sort of bring them off the shelf. We have to thrust them into the public realm constantly. So his design for the AIDS quilt was to actually take it off the shelf and to thrust it into the public realm to the point where it became worn and frayed and would be consumed, you know. And so he literally sort of proposed to like stretch it across the street where it was actually literally driven over and people stepped on it. And his design in architecture school, he drew it on paper and then he taped it to the floor and he asked people to walk across his drawings, which nobody wanted to walk on it. You know, everybody was dancing around the drawings. They refused to step on it. And that sort of bodily sort of perception of, I can't step on this, I think is exactly what he wanted. You know, so his argument was we have to continuously thrust these into the forefront of our perception. We can't let them recede, you know. So whether you would want your AIDS quilt to be consumed in that way, I'm not sure, but it was super provocative to sort of talk about the idea that it almost needs to be consumed, and that in its sort of engagement and its wearing and tearing, you know, that is doing work. That is the work that it's doing, that it needs to do. So controversial, but super provocative.
Yeah. So let me bring up an issue that we definitely have been talking a lot about, and I know that we have Paul Lewis on this call, not to thrust him into the limelight, but if he would like to contribute, we'd love to hear it. But the issue of Cambridge Common and the debate that I know has been reinvigorated by the women's Suffrage Centennial Memorial going there, and the question of, do we see it as, I believe one historian called it our national mall, where we use it as a commemorative space, and so anything that we deem of public value, public memorial value, needs to go in that space to be legitimate, or to sort of add to the pantheon, or do we try to spread memorials and monuments out throughout the community? And I know that there was some discussion of having the women's suffrage centennial over by the library, the main branch of the library, and Cambridge Rindge and Latin. And there was debate among people in that neighborhood, and they said, no, we want our open space. And that debate between open space and memorials, and is it a gift? Do we consider it a gift to space things out so that folks in different neighborhoods of Cambridge can access that in their neighborhood, access a public memorial? Or do we see this central place where all of our values and the things that we want to memorialize should live in the same area? I'm curious to hear Eric's thoughts and Paul and anyone else who wants to jump in on that.
I mean, I do think there is a limit to what we can perceive. You know, you could say we live in a kind of culture of distraction, and attention is in a way a super valuable resource, right? So advertisers are paying for our attention, you know, I have a 9-year-old, and I sort of have this tug of war with her device, you know, and these devices are designed to capture our attention. You know, everything that sort of flickers across the screen is sort of, you know, designed to sort of fight for our attention. Walter Benjamin said, you know, art is perceived in a space of attention, because when we see art, we're in a gallery and it's sort of framed for us. Architecture, on the other hand, is perceived in a space of distraction. We're on the street, you know, someone's bumping us from behind, there's advertising signage, there's a bus going by. So architecture is always competing for our attention in a different way than art does. I would group monuments and memorials in that public realm space of distraction. And that's why at UVA, we tried to create a new horizon to sort of envelop you in this horizon line so that you could become focused. You could start to focus inward. The memorial landscape is a space of distraction, you know, and the response can't be spectacle. You know, so much contemporary architecture is about, you know, I'm getting your attention because I'm shaped in a funny way, right? So I think this is a very interesting topic. Like, if we're fighting for attention, how do we sort of compete with devices, with media, with advertising, with, you know, all the hustle and bustle of the city? So I think to be contemplative, I think we need spaces of semi-privacy, whether it's a grove of trees, whether it's a semi-enclosure. And I think creating the settings for thoughtfulness, I think, is the challenge of all these things. You know, how do we prepare the mind for a kind of ability to be contemplative?
Agreed. And I think it reminds me of the concept of, I live out in Framingham, and there's an area, a little stretch with 3 corners at an intersection have gas stations on them. And I know that when I want gas, even though there's other, you know, single stations somewhere else, that's where I go. And I kind of think of that as like gas station alley, right? So I go to fill up my car there. And I wonder if Cambridge Common then becomes something like that, where we say, if it's legitimate or if it's important, or if I want my fix of history of monuments, I go there and I kind of do the rounds, and that's where I, you know, that's my center for it. And then I get lazy and I don't go and in search of history and of memorialization in other parts of the city. And so I wonder, you know, if we're creating something that is the be all and end all of our values encapsulated in that one space, and that's our go-to, and we don't look outside of it. So
I think the Freedom Trail does a good job of like pushing people into the city and, you know, and stringing together a significant moment. I feel like we are the kind of attention deficit generation, but we need to do some work too. You know, we can't just sort of expect it all to be, you know, laid out in front of us. I think the idea that monuments and memorials are meant to be read means that the reader has to invest some effort, some time, you know, some footsteps to engage with it. Otherwise, we just sit in front of our TVs.
Beth, can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Yes.
This is Paul. And as a boomer, it's taken me the last 5 minutes to figure out how to unmute my microphone. So I apologize.
Well, we're glad you did.
Can you see me?
We can see your photograph. We cannot see you.
Well, that's probably good enough, because I don't think you want to see me actually. But anyway, it's been so long since it took me so long to figure out how to unmute myself that I forgot the issue that you brought up when you used my name.
The Cambridge Common. We're talking about your paper and the discussion of the Cambridge Common. Right.
Well, I presented a talk to the society 47 years ago. So I had to reread the printed publication of it just to remember exactly what I was talking about. But I can tell you this, that I determined through the research that I had done from lots of sources that the common became sort of by default a place to erect monument, actually monuments, I would say, in terms of Eric's definition. So you have, for example, some major ones, and you have lots of little tiny minor ones, little stones with names in them and stuff. And they're spread throughout the common. And the common, because it was such a central location and probably only one of the only open spaces around, became a place that began itself to collect monuments. So that's what you have there. As the common became even more special after its all of its other functions as a sort of a place to collect monuments. And there's two major ones that, as I recall. There's Soldiers Monument, which is sort of in the dead center of the common, and also there's a statue of John Bridge, who is the epitome of the Puritan. Some group decided to erect that. So the whole collection of statues and monuments in the common took place between the 1870s and the 1930s. And at the time I was doing this research and paper, the common was going through a design process to re-embellish and improve it up to modern standards. And that's the point at which I moved away from there. So I never got to really see and experience the end result of the refurbishment of the common. But in my opinion, it's really became by default a place that collected lots and lots of monuments, and you can stroll through the common and sort of experience them. And I'm not sure that anybody ever put them all together into a written document, so that like a guide, like a map that shows you where all these things are. But anyway, that's the essence of the research I did.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting to see that the major tension that folks have, the people that don't want to see any more memorials built on the common, what they want to see is the preservation of open space. And particularly, I keep hearing and reading the commentary, well, people need a place to gather for important things, for meetings, for rallies, for these temporary forms of community. And so it's really the makeshift temporary form versus the more permanent form, and those two things being really in tension with each other. And I think too, the question of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Memorial being, all of the designs that were finalists had some element in them of either shifting, moving, traveling among the city. There's a very participatory element to it, even if there is a stationary design. So I wanted to ask folks what they thought of that and the future of kind of memorials. I know that Eric is going to have to head off. It's 1 o'clock now. And as usual, we didn't get to finish, but that's why we'll have a part 3. Thank you so much, Eric. I so appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for all of your insights. It was wonderful.
Super fun to engage. Hope we can keep the conversation going.
Okay, all right. Well, stay tuned for part 3. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. It just went so fast, but look for our survey and look for information on part 3 coming up. Thank you all so much for joining us, and head over to our website if you want to sign up for our email list and get notifications for our next series of events. So thank you all so much. Take care.
Bye.